Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you some thoughts on a very important topic. And that is that it's not in every game that we can just create a straightforward attack or a straightforward plan. However, in chess, it is quite important in many positions to restrict your opponent's pieces. Sometimes we call it prophylactic. To demonstrate what I mean is, I borrowed two famous games. The first one we'll see, is played by no other than Bobby Fischer himself as white against the late world champion Vasily Smyslov. This is the position they have reached after 25 moves of play. What do we see? We see a materially even position. We see that white occupies the open A file, and black potentially can move the knight out of the rook's way on the D file and will occupy the other open file. What's important in this position is to recognize the differences in the pawn structure, namely the fact that black has a pair of doubled pawns. Having double pawns are typically an inferior choice of pawn structure than having nicely connected pawns on separate different files. With all that said, the question is, how can white possibly make progress? In some cases, progress may mean restricting your opponent's plans or ideas. Let's see how Bobby Fischer, playing with white, accomplished this with his next move. Black clearly would like to put one of his minor pieces on c5, for example the knight, and then to get to d3, to a more active and threatening place compared to where it is right now. And white here played b4 with a clear idea to prevent that plan. Of course, you may wonder, but is it a good idea to put our pawn on the same color as the opponent's bishop is? And this is an exception from that rule. And this is one of the reasons why chess is such a complex and difficult game, because there are so many rules or suggestions or principles, and then at times you need to choose which one is more important one over another. Like in this case, what's more important? To make sure we don't blockade our pawn on the wrong color square, or to prevent black's counterplay coming to c5. Obviously, in this case, the answer is the prevention of the opponent's counterplay is more important. How do we know when is which principle more important? Well, I guess you just develop that sense by practicing, by observing other great players' games. For example, by listening to this lesson. Well, here the key point is that the black bishop with the given pawn structure has a real difficulty in attacking either of those two pawns on b4 or c3. As you can see, the only way black could possibly attack the base of that pawn chain, that is the c3 pawn, if it would get somehow behind it, like to d2 or e1 or b2. However, if you think realistically, it's not hard to recognize that that's quite unrealistic anytime in the near future, or ever even. So therefore, white doesn't seem to have much to worry. Of course, the other question still remains, how will white make progress in order to win the game? Well, let's see how Smyslov continued. King f7, following the general principle in getting the king closer to the center, hence we're in an endgame already. Another important suggestion in positions when we don't have specific tactical opportunities or forceful moves, to simply try to improve our least well-positioned piece at the moment. And that's exactly what white started doing. Clearly, the rook is quite well-positioned on a1, the bishop on e3, the knight on f3 is already pressuring on the pawn on e5. We can see, on the other hand, that the white knight on g3 is not ideally positioned, as there is not much to do there for the knight. Better squares could be on the queen side, like going, for example, to b3 or even d3 or a3, that at least have some kind of ideas what the knight does. Then, of course, the other piece that needs improvement is the white king that's on h2. Since the queens are no longer on the board, the king doesn't need to be so well protected. In fact, it could be more active somewhere else. So for now, white continued with knight f1, regrouping the knight. Black continued with bishop d6, kind of freeing up the knights as well as the e7 square for the king. Came g3. Black played knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4. White protected it, and came king e7. Okay, now the knight is on d2, a better square than it was on g3, more central. So now it was time to make an active move, and white played rook to a6, attacking black's knight, and black now had to make a choice whether to move the knight or to protect it. The better way would have been to actually protect it for now with the king. After king d7, white's best plan would be to regroup the other knight as well. Now that black has such a solid defense on e5, the knight cannot achieve too much more in that direction, and the knight should go to e1 and d3, and c5 square is the target. Remember, if both knights can attack that square, that can be a really powerful entrance there for one of the knights. And now, black's best option would be knight b8, rook a5, and to protect the pawn with the king. White still maintains some advantage, but it would have been a whole lot harder to actually convert it to a win. So let's go back to our game position. When after rook a6, black responded with the inferior knight retreat immediately to b8. The big difference is that now, when the white rook attacks the pawn on b5, the black king is still too far away to protect the pawn. Therefore, black had no other choice but to do so with the pawn, c6. And now, it was time to bring the king to action, and came king g2. Knight bd7 and king f1. And this is a moment where black made a mistake, not finding the correct plan. Black's ideal plan here would be to exchange the rooks, and then, being left with only minor pieces, most likely the game is holdable. To achieve that, black should have temporarily retreat the knight to e8, and then follow it up with a plan to move the knight to c7 and offer the exchange of rooks. Although white still would have an advantage, after knight b3, knight c7, rook a7, rook a8, white must play very forcefully to arrive timely to immediately attack now the pawn on c6, knight a5, knight b8, rooks got traded, bishop a7, threatening to capture the knight, and then the pawn on c6. So black must play king d7. And now white still has an advantage after playing knight b7. So let's go back and see how the game continued after king f1. So the game now continued by black playing rook to c8. And white can continue and should, again with the regrouping of the knights. And Fischer did it by playing knight to e1, and now came knight e8, knight d3, knight c7. So black is continuing with that same correct plan, but just one move too short. Remember, black wasted the move by playing rook c8 without any specific purpose. And that's what they are paying for. But how can white take advantage of this situation, of that loss of time? Well, white must play an energetic move, and Fischer did so by playing c4. What's happening right now is that white is about to advance the pawn further to c5, trapping the bishop on d6. So therefore, black has difficulties. Black captured on c4 and the knight captured back. Now we can see that the pawn on e5 is being threatened. But what would happen if black right now plays rook to a8? Then Fischer planned to exchange rooks and then follow it up by going after the pawn on c6. After knight b8, going after the knight, trying to again capture on b8 and then on c6, king d7, and knight back to c4. What a nice maneuver, misplacing the two black knights in the corner, and now that the black king is on d7, taking away the important square from the knight, the e5 pawn all of a sudden is lost. Very nice. Let's go back one more time. After knight c4, black in the game responded with a logical looking knight b5, covering up the fifth rank where the white rook was attacking the pawn on e5. Now that black has covered up that pawn on e5, white needs to look for a new target. And that new target should be black's other weakness, the pawn on c6. Therefore, Fischer played rook a6, not only targeting the pawn with the rook, but also clearing the a5 square for white's knight. Before we continue with the game, let's see what may have been the plan for white if black would play knight b8, trying to chase the rook away. Well, then the rook would go to a8, pinning black's knight. Okay, but what if then the knight goes back to c7, continuing to chase the rook? While the rook could certainly go back to a7 and pin the other knight, it is clearly much better to make the intermediate move and to capture on d6. Now the black rook is hanging, so black must capture back, and here again, white is in no rush to retreat the rook, but should first give a check, very important intermediate move, and only when the king moves back, still not to move the rook away, but capture the pawn with a check, and only when now the king moves away, then the white rook can retreat to a7 and being already a pawn up. Of course, I can point out also that if the king goes to the wrong square to d8, then white would immediately continue with a little combination and win another pawn by capturing the knight and then following it up with knight c6 fork, king c8, capturing the rook, and now another important little detail, while of course there are many winning moves here, including playing bishop f8, but the best is of course to pin the knight and making sure to transpose to a pawn endgame, because that avoids any kind of counterplay of the opponent and the simplest win. So let's go back now and see how the game itself resumed after white's rook a6 move. Smyslov continued by playing king f6, putting more protection on the e5 pawn. Now black seems to be protecting everything on time. So therefore, it was time for white to look for improvement in the positioning of his pieces. And he came up with a brilliant plan. to relocate the white bishop from e3 to b2. And that's especially powerful in view of black's king being on f6. So therefore, white played bishop c1. What we can notice in this whole endgame that we're seeing is that white is having total control and white has various plans while black is purely on the defense. Black played bishop b8 and came bishop b2. Now the plan is clear. White wants to play f4 using the pin. Black tried to get out of passivity by playing c5. Of course, black would be happy to exchange some pawns and pieces to get out of the bind, but white by no means is under any obligation to do so. In fact, right now, white has two excellent moves. One is to play rook a5 and then win a pawn on c5, and the other one is, as Bobby Fischer has played, by playing knight b6. It's true, this is also inviting the exchange of a pair of knights. However, as a result, white will win at least a pawn. The game continued by knight captures, rook captures back, and now black is in serious trouble. Game c4, knight c5. Now there are new threats with a check on d7 and then winning the bishop. Game c3, and white slowly and calmly just moved away to c1, while black is still stuck with the problem of the fork with knight d7, as well as the knight being attacked on b5. Therefore, black resigned. Now let's move on to a more current game that was played by Grandmaster Geller as white versus Grandmaster Michal Csikszin. Here we are. In this position, things seem to be okay for black. It's true, the white rook is on the 7th rank, which is usually a big achievement, and the white rook on the f-file is also in a good position. However, it looks like the black knight is about to come to f5 and kind of cover up any kind of dangers on the f-file. White also has a weakness, or a potential weakness at least, on e5 in an isolated pawn. So here again, it's quite important the prevention of the opponent's plans. And to achieve that, white played an outstanding move. Try to think if you can come up with that idea. Well, that brilliant, quiet, but effective move is g4. As you can see, all of a sudden, that same black knight on g7 that seemed to have a powerful plan in coming to f5, all of a sudden is completely stuck. The pawn on g4 is controlling the f5 and h5 squares and therefore greatly limiting black in its activity. Black immediately tried to get out of that bind and played h5. And this is one of those situations when you definitely should not trade on h5, because then the black knight indeed would get activated. We want to maintain this whole idea of guarding the f5 and h5 squares. And therefore, white played h3, simply trying to sustain a pawn on g4. Black traded pawns, but that doesn't change the actual essence of the situation on the king side. And now white's plan is simple. Just improve the position little by little. Maybe soon the knight could come to e4 and then to f6. And the problem for black is the lack of counterplay. As we already discussed, the knight is kind of stuck on g7. The rook is stuck on e8, protecting the bishop on e7. The bishop cannot move because then all of a sudden the two rooks would wonderfully cooperate by both attacking the f7 pawn. The rook from c6 cannot move because it's busy guarding the pawn on b6. So in reality, we kind of see that black is almost like in a zugzwang position. So black right now played b5, trying to get out of that bind, in hopes that after white captures, and if now captures a second time on b5, then the pawn on c2 will be lost, and indeed, black would get some counterplay. But white had a much better plan in mind, sacrificing the pawn on c2 and playing knight e4. Black accepted the sacrifice, lack of any better choice, and now knight f6. Check. Of course, this move forks black's king and rook, so black doesn't have many good choices. But the problem is, after the exchange on f6, all of a sudden, that same knight on g7 that we already talked about is trapped. Black is already in a lost position. Capture the pawn on b2, and white captured the knight. And here another problem of tactics, that if king captures on g7, white can either just fork with bishop d4, winning the rook on b2, or of course rook 1 from f1 to capturing on f7 also leads to checkmate pretty shortly. So the pawn is taboo on g7. Black played f5, trying to advance his connected pawns, but it doesn't really accomplish the goal. White now that the g7 pawn is well protected by the rook from d7, simply brings the rook to f3 with the idea to go to h3, and then voila, checkmate. Black captured on g4, for now guarding the entry square on h3, and came rook to f4. Black is in a hopeless situation. Played rook c8, trying to prevent the white bishop from getting to c5, but it didn't really help, because that bishop goes there anyway. And now black is helpless from preventing the white rook on getting to f8, which of course will easily guarantee the win, because then the g-pawn will promote. A very well played game by Geller, and what's common in the two examples we saw in this lesson is how to prevent counterplay by the opponent, how to take away key squares from the opponent's pieces by simple, quiet, preventive moves. And last but not least, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we are. In this position, composed by Lazard, white has an amazing win. Not very difficult, but very brilliant. Good luck in finding the solution to this beautiful puzzle. The first move is pretty given. Simply promote the pawn to a queen. But black can do just the same. And remember, black is a bishop up. So how on earth could white win this game? Well, by finding the correct move right now. And that is a beautiful queen sacrifice, queen c5. If black does not accept it, white will just capture black's queen. But if they do, things are even worse after knight b3 checkmate. Well, hope you enjoyed this lesson and learned some important ideas. So long, until next week. Bye-bye.